You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. If you are listening to the podcast of this, it is located at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. This is a reading of a collection of lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled First Steps in Christian Religious Renewal. This is Lecture 2, given in Stuttgart on June 13th, 1921. My dear friends, of the two areas you spoke of yesterday, it seems to me that we must begin by treating the area that will provide the foundation for the entire work. Naturally, we must begin by preparing the real ground for this work, and in our time that can only be done by building community. In our discussions, then, we will better come to terms with what should develop upon this real foundation if we talk first about community building itself. In spite of the fact that community building can easily be underestimated, it is, without a doubt, on the one hand, the most difficult task you will have, and, on the other, the most urgent. You can see this in the form that the youth movement has taken. The youth movement, as it exists today in the most varied forms, has a distinctly religious foundation. Thoughtful members of the youth movement always stress this religious foundation. And if you look impartially into this movement, you will notice something in it that is closely connected with community building. Consider for a moment the following phenomenon this youth movement manifests. The movement arrived on the scene some time, even years ago. How did it do so? It originated at first with young people explicitly striving to connect with one another. It appeared unmistakably under the slogan of association, of group building. But the significant phenomenon here is that in recent years the movement has transformed itself largely into its opposite. Precisely those who took this movement perhaps most seriously are now at the point of isolation, of becoming hermits. They stress the impossibility of associating with others. Why is that? If one views things symptomatically, especially in Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe, it is perhaps one of the most significant social manifestations that the desire to become psychologically a hermit, and actually a certain fear of association, formed so quickly out of the striving for community in the youth movement. If you know the youth movement, you may discover some other aspects here and there, but if you examine the matter impartially, you will find you have to characterize the relevant impulses in the way I have just done. What lies at the bottom of all this? What underlies this situation is that it is clear that the youth movement contains a distinctly religious impulse, and that the religious community has not known how to retain and support these young people within it. Originally, the youth movement arose from a rejection of the principle of authority, of patriarchal life, of looking up to the experience of one's elders. It was a blow to humanity's patriarchal principle of authority. The times had then changed to the point that one simply no longer believed in the fathers. One simply had no trust for the fathers deep within one's subconscious. But human beings need human beings, especially when it is a question of actions and effectiveness. People sought association with others, but they could do so only out of that spiritual life which today is anchored in human hearts as they live and are brought up in our ordinary schools, under traditional religious impulses, and so on. Religious yearning naturally stirs in young people, precisely when outwardly something in religious life is not in order, but stirs only as an indeterminate, abstract feeling, as something nebulous. And at the same time, connected with this religious desire, the yearning for community life also begins to stir. However, out of all that the youth could receive, out of all that is available, the possibility of building true community does not arise. What does arise, if I may express myself somewhat radically, is only the possibility of forming cliques. This is a characteristic of our time, that where there is a wish to build community, it does not occur. A true inner sense for community building does not arise. What does arise is a sense for clique building. By clique, I mean an accidental community, a coming together and a feeling of community with those who are nearest at hand. What brings people together through an accident of place or of circumstances leads to the forming of cliques. Yet all of such cliques, because they are not based on a truly spiritual foundation, bear the seed of their dissolution within them. Cliques dissolve. They are not lasting communities. Communities can endure only on condition that they are founded on a firm, shared belief in community life. For those who know the history of social life, it is no surprise that what begins only in the formation of a clique cannot develop into real community life. To those who know this, it is no surprise that these young souls become hermit-like, experiencing in themselves the desire not to join with others, and yes, even in the end, developing a certain fear of joining in. All those who once participated fully in the youth movement now go more or less their own way. And so, because the youth movement proceeded out of a shaking or overturning of the patriarchal principle of authority, it is clear that this recent historical movement of young people does not bear the seeds for any real community building. What you must seek in the first place is thus certainly community building. And in this regard, if you wish to achieve a goal that has truth and is filled with reality, there is nothing else to be done than to work in a practical manner out of the impulse of threefolding. You will need to be aware of how you can work practically out of the threefold impulse. In your profession, there is absolutely no need to campaign or agitate for threefolding in an abstract manner. Yet it is quite possible, precisely in your profession, to work for it in a practical way. But you will succeed only if you seek the way to those to whom you wish to speak. You must find a real effective path to the founding of communities. Now, you do not need to think that to do something like this you must become a revolutionary in a radical sense. That is not necessary at all. For instance, it might happen, in the ordinary course of events, that you receive a position as a pastor or a preacher. On the other hand, it could also happen that you successfully direct outer material circumstances in one place or another, so that you are able to found a completely independent community or congregation. Yet such independent communities, as well as other communities into which you intend to bring freedom of religious life, must belong together. And this can be the case only when you are striving let me read that again. And this can be the case only when what you are striving for becomes a power, a force. Please, do not misunderstand me. I am not talking about preaching the principle of pure power, but of one's preaching having a justified power, which comes about when you have a certain number of like-minded people. Anything less will not make an impression in the world. You must, in fact, be able to have priests from your actual circles spread out over a large territory. For this, one day you will have to expand your circle to at least 10 times its current size. This will be your first task, to seek to create just such a large group of like-minded people. You will have to begin by doing so in the way that your own small group here has formed. Only when the same striving is to be seen in, relatively speaking, the most distant places, when a connection with you exists throughout a large territory, only then will you be able to proceed to the building of communities. This is true whether you become a priest in the way that is recognized today or in some other way. You will have to work in such a way that your community members will be able to bond with you inwardly, in their hearts. By bond, I do not mean that you trap or enchain them in any way. The point is that community members must receive through you the consciousness to live in a certain kind of brotherliness and sisterliness. Brotherly and sisterly feelings must be born within the communities, which must recognize their priest as a self-evident leader and authority to whom they can turn with concrete questions. First of all, strange as it may seem at first, you must establish yourself within these communities as a self-evident authority on economic life. You do not need, in an incendiary way, to call these communities brotherhoods or the like. But members of the community must be able, personally, to recognize your authority, and to seek advice in economic matters and anything associated with economic life. When they ask their priest or pastor about something, they must be able to have the feeling that they are receiving a kind of directive from the spiritual world. You see, if you observe life, you will find in seemingly insignificant symptoms things that will provide you with direction. For example, I was walking along a street in Berlin when I met a pastor I had known for a long time. He was carrying a suitcase. I wanted to be polite and ask him a question. Therefore, given the circumstances, it was natural that I asked him, "How are you going on a trip?" Are you going on a trip? "No," he answered. "I'm going to perform an official duty." Now, you might see this as terribly insignificant, but in the context of the whole event, I found this reply to be extraordinarily significant. The pastor in question was, in fact, more a theologian than a pastor in relation to his work. Inwardly, however, he was a very serious person. In his bag he was carrying the things he needed to perform a baptism, and yet he spoke and felt in a way that acknowledged he had someone standing before him who would understand the expression, "I am going to perform an official duty." This is somewhat the same as when a policeman seeks to arrest a thief. The policeman too goes to perform an official duty. Any connection with official life or the like must disappear completely from the way in which pastors or priests do their work. Their whole way of feeling, as it then flows into how they speak, must be that of a person who, out of the free impulse of their human personality, acts out of his or her consciousness of God. They must be conscious of this fact. I am not performing this as an official duty, but naturally, out of my innermost being, because the divine power has led me to do it. One might consider this a secondary matter, yet precisely the fact that one sees such things as minor is perhaps what harms religious effectiveness most of all. We must begin to see such things as essential again. Only when we know ourselves to be permeated right into our subtlest feelings by the direct existence of the divine in the physical, when as priests we feel ourselves to be authoritative in that we know that we carry divine life into what we do, and do not simply perform an official act as is ordinarily done today, but rather that we fulfill a mandate from God. Only when we feel all of this can we convey to the members of our community the imponderable spiritual element that must be conveyed. This seems to be quite a long way from economic life, and yet the way things are today, we cannot consider that what we are striving for here in Stuttgart with the threefolding is relevant also in other areas of life. Here we are working on the threefold impulse out of the social organism as a whole. For your profession, however, it is a question of something else. Each of the three parts of the threefold social organism is actually contained within your area of work. Even if they are not organized properly, they are there, and in your profession it is a matter of penetrating each of these three parts with religious, spiritual life. Although when it comes to the seeking of advice, complete freedom reigns within the communities, within which economic life also plays a role, the self-evident assumption, as it were, when it is a question of spiritual life flowing into the community, must be that in economic matters the decision rests with the priest. Such an agreement must exist, and for this priests must, above all, live in heartfelt connection with the whole charitable, service-oriented life of their community. They must know how to reconcile social differences. We must strive for this in the communities. The priest must, in fact, be a consultant for the men, and in a certain way also a helpful counselor for the women, helping them in their volunteer work. When it comes to organizing matters of economic life, economic aid, and economic collaboration, in a higher sense, men and women must both feel unconditionally, and as a matter of course, that the priest is to have a say in it all. Especially in today's difficult economic life, religious communities cannot be founded if the priest does not take an interest, a participatory interest, in economic life. It is true that to begin with we can present this only as an ideal, yet in fact in one area or another we will more or less be able to approach this ideal. Naturally, if you strive for such an ideal, you will meet an infinite number of obstacles. You will experience rejection, but you must bring it about that members of your community attain the consciousness I have just characterized, and that by their own desire they discover the necessity of listening to the priest's incisive guidance in economic life. I must say that for the priest who lives in a religious community, much of this, above all much of what is in the rights or political sphere, must remain an ideal. Let me give a concrete example. Because religious life has increasingly lost its real footing or ground, things have arisen in social life that people today think are extraordinarily enlightened, but which in fact completely undermine religious life. Consider, for instance, today's view of marriage legislation. It is undoubtedly necessary that marriage laws, to a certain extent, must always conform to the threefold social organism, irrespective of whether you take threefolding in the strict sense or more loosely due to other circumstances. For this, of course, we must feel clearly that marriage itself, as an institution, is in every way an image of the threefold social organism. First, marriage is an economic community, and so it must become a part of the social organism inasmuch as it plays an economic role. Thus, we must look for a relationship between the economic community, as presented by marriage, and that presented by associations. Today, we can do little more than think about this, yet the consciousness must arise in our communities that the economic side of the marriage must be supported by the actions of associations, of economic life. Second, the rights relationship must clearly be felt as a separate element of its own. The state has to do with the rights relationship of a marriage only inasmuch as the contract of marriage is a matter of the law. In contrast, within your religious community, You as priests must claim the right to give the spiritual blessing upon a marriage in full freedom, out of your own decision, as your own special concern. You will have to strive for the ideal that the religious blessing of a marriage lies within the freedom of your religious decision, and that this decision will be absolutely respected, so that it will be viewed as the basis for something else. Namely, it will be the foundation of trust that exists within the community, and on the basis of which the priest's decision is sought for a marriage in the first place. I know that such a thing as this is looked upon, even by many Protestants today, as no longer appropriate for our times. However, I can only say that the fact that such things are seen as out of date shows the defects of civilization that most inevitably undermine religious life. Thus you must bring to the members of your community the awareness of the fact that the actual inner spiritual core of marriage has to do with religious life, and that throughout this area the threefold impulse must be put into practice. This means that all three parts of a marriage must gradually find their form within social life, that all three must be within it. With regard to threefolding, we should not imagine that we are automatically setting up a utopian program that one should threefold things. We divide social life into these three parts best when we comprehend that all of life's institutions implicitly contain a threefold nature, and when we understand how to organize individual things so that the threefold impulse underlies them. Precisely within your profession, perhaps, you do not need to place too much weight on representing the threefold impulse abstractly. We must only understand that life demands that threefolding occur, that is, that each of the three particular parts of the social organism is a truly concrete, existing reality. Naturally, you will meet with great resistance against this today. Yet precisely in such cases of resistance, you can develop, even if at first only in a way that has only an explanatory effect in your community, the relationship in which independent spiritual life, which above all contains the religious element, stands in relation to what must come to be. This can be done, not by giving well-intentioned speeches about a mutual tolerance, but rather by placing before people as their ideal what the circumstances really require. Naturally, if you do this, you must expect that you will be met with the greatest resistance. Third, you must have the possibility of really developing free spiritual life as it is meant to be in a threefold social organism. Today in society generally, we absolutely no longer have spiritual life. We have an intellectual life, but we have no spiritual life. We have, I might say, no dealings of the gods with human beings. We are not conscious of the fact that the working of the divine world should be present through us in everything that takes place outwardly in the physical world. Nor are we aware that bringing the Spirit really and truly into the world, into actions that play a role in economic life, as well as in the rights and laws of the state, and in the education of the young, and likewise in the instruction of the old, must be a free deed, performed by human beings participating in this spiritual life. This reality must be understood. For this reason, you will have to fight for the full authority of your own independent will. This, too, is naturally a demand of our time, that the individual who gives a sermon does so under his or her own authority. You see, in this area, we must simply look at the mighty collision of opposites reigning today. When I go to a Catholic church, and it comes time for the sermon, I see that the priest wears the stole. I know that when he is wearing the stole, the human being who stands there in the pulpit and preaches is absolutely not to be considered. the Catholic priest actually bears this in his consciousness. In reality, he does not feel himself to be humanly responsible for any of his words, because from the moment he crosses the stole over his heart, it is the Church that speaks. And since the formal dogmatic decree of infallibility, the Pope in Rome determines ex cathedra everything proclaimed by the Catholic Church. Thus, in the Catholic preacher, I have before me a human being who, in the moment of the sermon, empties himself and does not for a moment think of representing his own opinion. He believes with absolute conviction that he can have a personal opinion that he keeps to himself and that may not agree at all with what he speaks from the pulpit. For him, his personal opinion does not come into consideration. In the moment when he crosses the stole over his heart, he is the representative of the Church. This is one extreme, yet it exists, and it will play a large role in the cultural movement about to be ushered in. As ruinous as we must consider this power, it is a power, an enormous power, that we cannot approach in any other way than to become fully conscious of it. You will not be able to fight it in any other way. With every step you take, you will meet this power, which is spreading in an immeasurable way while humanity sleeps and does not notice it. On the other hand, you have, if I may call it so, divine harmony, which is the task of our times and in which we must trust. This divine harmony, my dear friends, as it is in my book titled The Philosophy of Freedom, also available under the title Intuitive Thinking as a Spiritual Path, has been totally misunderstood, yet it should be grasped today in the most eminent sense. In the philosophy of freedom, the life of rights, legal life, is based on individual human beings working completely out of their own selves. One of the first and indeed most profound critics who wrote about my philosophy of freedom in the English Athenaeum wrote simply that this whole view leads to a theoretical anarchism. This is, of course, the belief of many people today. Why? Because modern human beings lack real divinized social trust, because they cannot grasp the most important feature of our time, namely, that if we could really bring human beings to speak out of their inmost being, harmony would come about among them, not through their own will, but through divine world order. Discord arises because people do not speak out of their inner being. We cannot create harmony directly, but only indirectly, by bringing each human being to his or her innermost self. Then each person will do what benefits the other. As long as they have not found their own self, human beings act and speak at cross purposes. If we grasp that this phenomenon is a mystery of life, then we will say to ourselves, quote, I seek the source of my actions within myself, and trust that the path that leads me into my innermost being also places me into the divine world order in the outer world, and because of this I can work in harmony with others. Close quote. In this way, not only will trust be brought into our inner being, but also trust in outer social harmony. There is no other way to bring human beings together. Therefore, if in your profession you wish to work socially, in a divine social manner, in a spiritual social manner, you must achieve the ability to work out of your inner being, which means that just because each of you has found yourself, you have the possibility of being an authority. The Catholic preacher removes his individuality. He crosses the stole over his heart and is no longer himself. He is the Church. The Catholic Church has the magical means, without trust in the power of the individual, of influencing social life powerfully through the effect of outer symbols on the soul. This method was necessary to found communities around the end of the second millennium, before the mystery of Golgotha. It was in its most ideal form in ancient Egypt, and in a roundabout way, which can be ascertained historically, it became the inner essence of the Catholic Church. The nature of the Catholic Church is such that still today it has the viewpoint of the inner makeup of the Egyptian priesthood, and of social life as it was approximately 2 millennia before Christ. In the Catholic impulse, what is old and past is working into our time. In contrast to this is the need to stand today completely in our time, and to feel ourselves as no more than bearers of that divine life which has become intellect within us. You must win freedom of speech for yourselves, so that no one can question the content of your sermon, so that there is no outer standard for the content of your sermon. You will not found communities in any other way than by making it a principle to gain freedom of the sermon. With these few words I have sketched, as it were, the beginning of what must arise from one's own inner being and lead to community building. If you are able to actualize these things, you will in turn also bring young people into the building of community, whereas, on their own, they have managed only to form cliques. I have the conviction and also the trust that if you realize these things, then, above all, young people will come together in such communities, and something fruitful can come of it. 15 or 20 years ago, young people sought to join together in the so-called youth movement, but they were without a leader, because no one believed in the fathers anymore, and so they strove for community building without any actual inner impulse. The result was only the forming of a clique. Today, their souls are hermits, yet such hermit souls would join together immediately if the possibility of a truly independent community appeared. This means, above all, that young people would come together in a community that has inner freedom. It goes without saying that we also have difficulties with such things in our anthroposophical movement, because today the anthroposophical movement can be nothing other than a completely universal movement. It must apply to all areas of life. Indeed, as regards the anthroposophical movement, we are in a particularly difficult situation. On the one hand, a certain anthroposophical truth must be communicated to the world. It must be given to the world, because the world lacks the possibility of receiving spiritual content from the spiritual world. On the other hand, the striving to build communities, to some degree to form anthroposophical communities, has arisen everywhere. Call them branches, or what you will. There is a striving to found anthroposophical branches. Yet because these anthroposophical branches must be universal, they cannot really come to life. They oscillate between a religious element and a spiritual element, oriented toward all branches of life. Therefore, naturally, they do not achieve a truly brotherly, sisterly attitude. They absolutely do not understand the social task that lies in the fact that in small communities we can found a concrete model that then could spread throughout humanity. Either they degenerate into merely disseminating the content of anthroposophical teaching as doctrine, or they feel within themselves a resistance to uniting together, and so divide in their opinions and quarrel, and so on. Yet when we ask where the problem lies, it is not in the communities, but in the fact that today people cannot find an actual connection to religious life, even though they are able to penetrate the spiritual world cognitively. Anthroposophists do not find a religious life in any of the denominations existing today. Religious communities must be there first. but they can be there only if we earnestly provide everything that can lead to the founding of such communities. If the attitude that I have tried to characterize for you today permeates you, then the possibility of forming institutions will not prove so difficult if there are enough of you. Once you have 10 times as many people as you have now, preparing to take up the profession of priest throughout Germany, thus over a large territory, then you will be able to build community. Community building forms the foundation of your religious work. We must be clear about this aspect before we can go on to speak further about the ritual and the sermon. Now I would like to ask you to say or ask anything in relation to your specific thoughts, wishes, and so on. You may have concerns about specific things that I mentioned, or you might feel that a question has not yet been discussed sufficiently, or you might have more practical questions. A participant. Even though the practical aspects might simply emerge, it would perhaps be of great importance to hear about this or that practical aspect, since some of us are already engaged in practical situations. Therefore, I would ask that you say something about the possibilities for affiliations or connections. There are, to begin with, 2 possible opportunities, either through the Church or through a connection to existing anthroposophical communities. Above all, will it be possible later to find a connection through working out of the Church? The fear that such a connection cannot be found holds some of us back, even though we could already now enter into the service of the Church. What should we do? This perhaps already contains the question of what is practical, but the principal question is about the possibilities of affiliation. We are just not clear about where we can immediately connect in a practical manner. Are we wasting an opportunity by entering into service to the Church now, in the hope that there will be a way to connect later? Would it not be better for us to do something else? We must, after all, connect with something, somewhere. Rudolf Steiner. The situation is such that it requires that the answer to this question must be multifaceted. The answer is not the same in every situation. In spite of the difficulties presented by the Church, there are indeed still always opportunities to work out of the Church itself, opportunities that one should perhaps not leave unused. Considering the specific circumstances here and there, if you want a position within the existing forms, you could say that given the overall nature of a community, you yourself could found your own community there. You could then gradually lead it out of current ecclesiastical circumstances, whereas you would not be able to get members of your community if you wanted to simply gather them from outside the Church. On the other hand, there are certain areas where it will no longer be possible to work out of the Church. Then, naturally, you will have to found free, independent communities. I would just recommend that you do not, under any circumstances, try to join together with the anthroposophical branches, etc., and that you not try to work out of anthroposophy itself, because then the thread will break before you achieve anything. Anthroposophy as such will simply soon be opposed in unbelievable ways and from all sides. Your actual strength, even if there are 10 times as many of you as there are now, is not great enough to achieve peaceful community building within such a struggle. We do not live as yet in social conditions that would allow the building of religious communities out of anthroposophy itself. The building of religious communities must be taken up independently, and then the association with the anthroposophical movement be sought. I can say positively that the anthroposophical movement will not fail to support this association. However, it would not be beneficial, so to speak, to build church communities out of anthroposophical communities. You see, when we founded the Waldorf School, it is not an exact example, but there is at least a similarity. We did not proceed to found a school that taught a worldview, that taught anthroposophy. We sought merely to bring into the methods of education, the pedagogy and art of teaching, what anthroposophy could contribute. I firmly held the view that Catholic children should be taught by Catholic priests and Protestant children by Protestant ministers. However, it turned out that because the main portion of the student body of the Waldorf School was made up of the children of the workers of the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory, many children would have had no religious instruction at all. Therefore it became necessary, as it were, to provide anthroposophical religious instruction that was free, that is, non-denominational or non-sectarian. Yet in all the details, namely in my own relationship to the matter, I insisted that this anthroposophical religious instruction not fall within the organization of the school. Rather, such anthroposophical religious instruction comes into the school from the outside, just as the Catholic and Protestant instruction does. Thus the Waldorf School, as such, does not give any religious instruction. It simply allows the anthroposophical community to give anthroposophical religious instruction to those children whose parents wish it, just as Protestant children receive Protestant religious instruction and Catholic children receive Catholic religious instruction. In this area you must be serious about ensuring that the spiritual works only through the spiritual. As soon as people settle on a school system that would include the religious instruction within the curriculum of the school, they would probably achieve more to begin with than we do now, but later it would slowly disintegrate again. One must trust the Spirit, so that one works out of oneself. Therefore, in the anthroposophical movement, we stand before the great difficulty that when we found a branch, we do so in the outer world, where human beings always strive to work through outer means. But anthroposophy cannot work through outer means. It can work only through what works on the human being as a spiritual substance. These two things, outer branch building and inner effectiveness, are always in conflict. It is a confusing struggle. And yet the moment that community building out of the religious spirit becomes possible, the struggle would become something healthy. Here, naturally, it is a question of really overcoming, as it were, higher discomforts, if I may put it so. You see, when I speak to Swiss teachers about freeing spiritual life and freeing the nature of teaching, as a rule, even the best of them responds, quote, "Yes, in Switzerland we are actually quite free. We can do whatever we want in the school," close quote. But not one of them does anything other than what the state wants. Out of freedom, they are basically as unfree as is possible. They just do not feel their lack of freedom. They feel the lack of freedom to be freedom because inwardly they have grown so together with it. We must learn to feel the lack of freedom again. Once at a meeting for the threefold movement which I held in Switzerland, I could sense this in a quite remarkable manner, in a rather humorous manner, I might say. In the discussion, one person became enormously, almost fanatically heated, saying that in Germany everything was ordered by laws and police regulations. The people were ordered by law to be loyal, and to venerate the monarch with their loyalty. He raged terribly about this. I said to him, of course members of a republic might well rail in such a manner against the command of the monarch. Yet I remember that when the German emperor was in Switzerland a few years ago, people behaved toward him in an extremely devoted manner. Indeed, the image of devotion presented in Zurich by far surpassed what one was accustomed to in Germany. To which he responded, "Yes, that is precisely the difference between Germany and Switzerland. In Germany the people must do it, because they are ordered to. We do it voluntarily." Such is the difference between free human beings and those who are not free. Now we must, indeed all human beings must, this is quite international now, actually learn what it means to be a free human being. For this reason, I believe it is actually possible to connect within the Church with that element wherein freedom is still possible, and thus found free communities out of the Church itself. I do understand the difficulty, but you must merely consider the real cultural conditions in Central Europe. A certain kind of community building occurred, we must really learn from history, when, after the promulgation of the dogma of infallibility, Old Catholicism came into being. Now, when you look at the content of Old Catholicism, you must say that, with regard to its doctrine and the behavior of its priests, it is like the Protestant ministry. But Old Catholicism, nevertheless, has within it a ritual, which it has preserved in a simple, popular manner. We will still need to speak about this ritual. One may say that precisely because it arose as a reaction, Old Catholicism already contains what could have led to the building of communities outside of the Church. As you know, the Old Catholicism was taken up with great enthusiasm in Germany. Congregations formed here and there, but they could neither live nor die. Naturally, because such congregations could not be formed within the Roman Catholic Church, they had to be built independently. It would not have worked any other way. In Switzerland, where the Old Catholicism has survived much more than elsewhere, because there are more Old Catholic congregations there, it is now clearly evident that these congregations continue to live a conservative life, but do not grow. These congregations remain the same, or more likely, decrease. They are in a descending evolution. This is the great difficulty today with the building of independent congregations, or communities. Therefore, you will need to collect as many people as you can in order to form independent communities. They should not be gathered from among those who feel themselves a part of the Church, but from among those who do not feel that way, but have not yet been able to make the decision to leave the Church. You can bring these out in order to form your free communities. If you handle things in this way, you can be quite certain that you will be able to achieve a connection with the anthroposophical movement. In spite of the terrible battles it has to fight, the anthroposophical movement will secure its validity and worth, though perhaps only by the sacrifices of many of those working within it. By great sacrifices it will attain validity, but it is hardly able to found a branch of religious life today. This is why I spoke today about the special features of your profession, namely that the anthroposophical movement is hardly in a position to form communities in a specially religious sense. What I am continually stressing here must become a reality for you, namely, the anthroposophical movement as such cannot found new religious communities, and so on. You must somehow build these communities out of yourselves, or form them as far as you can out of human beings who are still within the Church purely out of their habitual bias. You could, however, perhaps reformulate the question more fully, so we could then speak about it more exactly. Dr. Rittelmeyer, who fell ill, would definitely have been able, because of how he related to his parishioners, to found a truly free community in Berlin. And once this community achieved a certain power and validity, and it was large enough, then no one would dare to bother the pastor. Is it actually your opinion that we should not have this last remnant of consideration for the Church? A participant: I believe that it will be especially difficult to work within the Church, and I do not yet see clearly how much we can do in this regard now. we must still wait to do the actual work until we can all begin together. Would it be possible already to seek points of contact with the Church? Yet, if we were already so far along, we would surely already be sent out. Rudolf Steiner. As long as you do not already have a pastoral position, you cannot seek such connections. Naturally, you must seek the preparation for religious work independently of the Church. At least you must be inwardly independent. As long as you are studying, as it were, you cannot look for some kind of integration with the Church. To begin with, you can only look around to see where it would be possible to draw such communities out of the Church. And if you find that this is absolutely impossible in Central Europe, free communities must be formed nevertheless, and the ways and means to do so must be found. Now, there are two things I would be against when it comes to an absolutely free founding of a community or congregation. This is that one of you goes to X and the other goes to Y, and by holding sermons there for 5, 10, or 20 people, you gradually create a community. The first difficulty I want to point out is that this method is, first of all, a slow one. You will see it is slow. It is the surest, but it is slow. The second difficulty is the question of resources. It is a fact that if community building were to be done in this way, it would have to be fully financed. It would have to be properly financed. Thus, the difficulties are that, first, a community would simply have to be founded by you, and second, the means of financing this community building would have to be found. Now, I must say that even if it has to be achieved with outer material resources, this is naturally the best way to build community. However, no matter which method you use, you will need on your part, I say this quite openly, great courage. Great courage will be called for. Naturally, you yourself will have to join in the struggles that will follow. You will have to participate in dealing with the difficulties, even the difficulties of financial funding. It would, of course, be easiest and best if you could attain sufficiently extensive means so that you were completely independent, and could then simply choose to gather together your community wherever you wished, even if it was made up out of the smallest groups of people. A community would then indeed come about. Community would form. But for it to do so, you would naturally need the financial foundation, and this today poses really extraordinary difficulties. Immediately and most pervasively, the established denominations would be there to hinder such a thing from developing. One cannot do such a thing on one's own. It must be organized as a large movement. You must found a community that is made up of all of those who take up this life goal. Then a financial foundation will have to be found for it. Now, you can work this out for yourselves. If you numbered, let us say, 200 people, that would be enough for this approach, because it is, as it were, a relatively safe approach and does not depend on speed. You can calculate how much you would need annually. As soon as you have the means to do it, you can do it. It is therefore the safest path. It is also the most obvious, and therefore the more natural one. However, given today's social and economic circumstances in Central Europe, raising such funds, and it can only be a matter of doing that, is terribly difficult. Nor can you do it anywhere else. Thus, it is absolutely out of the question to seek such funds in Eastern or Western Europe. In Central Europe, however, you could do it out of inner reasons, and precisely then you would be doing something truly great. Werner Klein. I must say that until now I had seen this last path as the only one we could take. Financing, of course, presents great difficulties, but we can overcome them. I believe, too, that we can, each one of us, on the basis of our own forces, hold our heads above water by developing a field of work in a city, perhaps trying to earn enough money by giving lectures. We can form friendships with people who then could help. But we could also take a job, since we are still living today in a time of shortened work hours. We could take a less meaningful position at the courthouse or somewhere else, where, out of necessity, we could support ourselves, in order still to have the time to do whatever else we want. I believe that we could hold our own this way. Yet at the same time we must also run a large-scale organization, and we must at least try to raise funds. Depending upon how much of this general yearning for something new and powerful lives in all of us in Germany, I believe that we will find something. It will depend on us, however. Today, for the first time, I see a second way, in connection with the Church. I think we can cooperate there. The direct path of creating an independent community demands a totally different tactic. It calls for approaching the goal together and proceeding together toward a common point in time when we step forth as a greater movement, with each of us standing on our own. The tactic of the other path is that each of us begins to work on our own and attempts to create new communities out of the Church. Neither of these paths will interfere with the other. When the time comes when those of us who have taken the surer but more difficult path are far enough along that we can, to put it bluntly, get going, then those of us who have until then taken the other path can join their work to ours and support us with real and positive fruits. If we manage to achieve success here or there in connection with the Church, that is only to be welcomed and considered as a positive factor in itself. If we really want to create something socially, in light of social religious need today, it seems to me that the first surer path is the best approach. In any case, we must try it. If we fail, then we can still take the other direction. When the other path is taken, at the same time by those who already want to work to fill their time in the meantime, that is to be welcomed. If we want great things, we must strive for and attempt to do great deeds. Rudolf Steiner. Here in Stuttgart, we have some experience of precisely the difficulties that have to be faced on what was just described here as the safest and surest path. Of course, I am of the opinion that this course of action can be taken if enough effort is put into it. Yet you must be aware of the difficulties that you will meet in every area. It takes exceptional goodwill to say that you can, somehow, take a job and can, in addition to that, work for the cause as we would want. However, it is an open secret that in the coming years students in German colleges will experience the most terrible financial difficulties. In this regard, all kinds of impractical things have been proposed. A professor even came to me and told me that because the students can no longer pay for the publication of their dissertations, one must think about setting up printing shops so that the students can print them themselves. Naturally, I do not have the slightest understanding for such a financial, quote, inbreeding, close quote. I do not know how, if they are to print their own dissertations, students would be able to earn what it takes to do this. I found it to be more rational, and I pointed this out, to do away with the requirement of printing the dissertations during this time of need. Thus every kind of impractical thing you can imagine is thought of. On the other hand, the matter is certainly very serious. I think, for instance, it would be a wonderful idea if the Der kommende Tag, the coming day, would provide a financial foundation for at least a few students by, for example, every 3 months hiring a different group of students to work on its projects. After 3 months, they could go back and study at the universities. That would be a wonderful idea to put into practice, if one could do it. But in our businesses, as soon as we wanted to do so, and hired a number of students, the union workers would revolt. They would tell us that it cannot be done. They would throw us out. And even if it was not a matter of getting thrown out, it would probably mean that no one was hired by the companies. Beyond this, I do not see, even with today's shortened work hours, how you can really take a job in addition to the profession you have chosen, because this profession requires your full devotion in order to fully satisfy its needs. I do not see a real possibility there. You see, we are facing the fact that because of difficult life circumstances, human beings are not as strong today as they actually should be. Therefore, I'm afraid that if each of you were dependent solely upon yourselves financially, it would lead at least to a mild form of neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion. It also seems to me to be fairly unlikely, under today's circumstances, that you could earn your support by giving lectures. You see, spiritual and cultural performance is paid according to the old currency value. We have just experienced this in a specific area, while food must be paid for according to the new currency value. When you are paid for cultural or spiritual work, you receive 30 Reichmarks according to the old currency. But for food you have to pay out 300 marks in the new currency. Thus the matter would be difficult. On the other hand, it would be of real value to put your efforts into funding in the most comprehensive sense. I also do not consider working together with the Church, which seems more appealing to Mr. Klein than to some of you, as being hopeless. I think there are advantages to linking this work with the Church. Parenthesis. Here there followed sentences that referred to the financing, but which were not complete and not clear. Close parenthesis. You can do both. I think experience shows us today that if you first succeed in creating independent communities out of the Church, you will find others to join you simply out of your actions. You will find others to join you in this work. People are not wrong when they say that there are many pastors in Protestant congregations who would gladly leave their position and need only an impetus to do so. If you succeed in drawing these people out of their congregations, then you will also find ministers to join you. They would be a good addition. They would help the movement to grow quickly. You would find reinforcements for your work, while those who joined you would not have had the initiative to do what you did on their own. If the impetus would be given from without, you would find reinforcements. Naturally, it would be most desirable if you could somehow or other tackle the question of financing. I say intentionally somehow or other, because if the financial problem is taken up properly, there is the likelihood for success. Starting this effort, if it is done properly, is much more difficult than succeeding in it, because today what is lacking, in the widest sense, is the ability of human beings to work together efficiently on the great tasks of life. Everywhere people become so stuck in their ruts that one cannot find co-workers who have enough vigor and initiative for the most important tasks. I think that we should use our time together to the fullest, and since we now have come to the practical issues that should be handled first, I would ask that we continue my meeting at 7 p.m. this evening.